I'm so emotional because I miss my man. I remember getting up every morning with him, making sure that he was getting up for work, making sure he was doing right by his kids. We will never get Sean back.
Unbeknownst to them, they're being stalked by the individuals in this red vehicle, as he was sitting side by side with his cold-blooded killer.
A lot of these cases are committed by people who are known to each other, whether it's rivals or enemies on the street.
If you really sum it up, the whole case was about revenge.
36-year-old Lestine Robinson wakes up in her hotel room in Vinings, Georgia, just outside Atlanta. She's on a trip from Chicago with her 22-year-old boyfriend, Sean Gray. But she's surprised to discover he's not there.
I woke up, I didn't have no cover on me, and I just had on my little lingerie. And I was reaching for him. I guess I was coming to my senses. I'm like, oh, hold up, Sean ain't been here with me all night. You know, since I fell asleep. I thought Sean had crept off. And I'm like, I'm texting him. And I'm like, I know you did not bring me to Atlanta to do this. Like, an hour went past and I was just laying there and I'm still texting, no Sean. I was calling Sean's phone and somebody had answered his phone. Finally, somebody picked up. I thought it was him. Then the man said, you been just calling this phone. I'm like, well, who is you? Cause now, this not Sean answering his phone. And Sean had two phones. Then the man hung the phone up. And when I called back again on the FaceTime, the lady from the front desk answers. I'm like, how you get these phones? You know, asking her. And she said that the guy had brought her the stuff. So I'm like, that's my man's phone. She like, laughed and joked like, well, did he lose some shoes or something? And I'm like, some shoes? I'm like, let me see the shoes. So I was laying in the bed. She showed me the shoes. This is Air Force Ones that he just bought while we was here in Atlanta. He bought them Thursday when we went to the mall. The shoes was bloody. The strings was scuffed up. I instantly jumped up. Where y'all get this from? And she like, in the parking lot. I ran right out the door with what I had on. I didn't come through that lobby presentable or even with a level head. I came in there going off, and they were trying to calm me down. I was saying everything that could come to my mind, because at this point, y'all got my man phones, y'all got his shoes, they bloody, his strings are scuffed up, his shoes are scuffed up. Now, where's my man?
Sean Gray was born in the inner city of Chicago, Illinois, to a drug-addicted mother and an absentee father. So his paternal grandmother was the one who was responsible for raising him and his other two siblings. Sean's grandmother really saved him and his siblings. She worked 2 jobs, she worked extremely hard, and that really stuck with Sean.
Sean was a good kid. He didn't get into much trouble growing up.
Despite a difficult childhood, Sean seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. But after high school, his grandmother passed away, and things took a different turn.
Sean was growing up in Chicago at a very violent time in the city's history. There were a lot of gang activities, there was a lot of drug activities.
Sean wasn't perfect, and no human being is perfect, and we all make mistakes. After Sean graduated North Chicago High School, he was trying to find himself, and he got caught up in the streets. He ended up going to jail for a little bit, I think for like a year or so. When Sean got out of jail, he did straighten himself up. He found them a job through a temp agency, working for Abbott Laboratories. Sean went to work every day, faithfully, Monday through Friday, as he should.
Sean ended up having 2 children of his own. He was a great father, a devout father. He took a chapter out of his grandmother's book and worked really, really hard to provide for his 2 children. Even though Sean was the father of 2 young kids, he was still single. He was out there looking for love, and he just happened to find it through Lestine Robinson.
Lestine was 13 years older than Sean, who was 22 at the time, and she was the mother of his 16-year-old friend, Alram.
We were having a nice cookout, and they pulled up, and he wanted to be fed because Sean liked to eat. And that's pretty much how me and Sean got together, from that cookout. And I was worried about what people would think about me and Sean dating, and especially the fact that him and my son were so close. Eventually it came out, and I was embarrassed at first, but after a while, it's like, I ain't care. It was like, hey, I'm into Sean, and I want the world to know that I'm proud to be with Sean.
Lestine and Sean's relationship definitely took some getting used to from all parties involved.
Especially Alram, who eventually came to terms with his mom dating his friend.
It really does speak to how much respect he must have had for Sean, that he would give the stamp of approval for him to date his mom of all people.
Sean was at a turning point in his life. I was like, if you let me be your friend and you're a woman, I'm gonna show you we can go a long way, and I'm gonna support you and everything. And that's pretty much what I did. It was like, if he happy, I'm happy. And that was the goal, to keep each other happy.
Things were going so well in their relationship that Sean asked Lestine to move in with him and his brother in the Chicago suburb of Libertyville.
At that point, I knew things was gonna get serious between us. And I had started to base my future around Sean.
So Lestine's birthday was coming up on January 16th. She wanted to do something big to celebrate, so she and Sean decided they would come to Atlanta for her birthday weekend.
It was supposed to be a romantic weekend between Sean and I. And Aram's grandma wanted him to come down for the weekend. We agreed to pick Aram up and drop him off to his grandma's house in Atlanta.
They rented a car and decided to drive down from Chicago to Atlanta. They got a nice hotel in a very nice, safe area in Cobb County, Georgia.
After a long drive, Lestine and Sean dropped Alram off with his grandmother and checked into their hotel on the 14th.
We go up to the room. We didn't even brush our teeth or nothing. We was just thirsty to be in Atlanta, happy. It just felt so good to be in another city with my man.
But now, 3 days into their trip, Sean has suddenly gone missing.
You can only imagine how Lestine must have felt, where you go from being annoyed that your boyfriend isn't in the hotel room to now it seems clear that something may have happened to him.
They had called the police and they were trying to calm me down. I just remember walking around that hotel looking for my man. I even walked up and down that lot.
As she gets closer to the rental car that they used to drive from Chicago to Atlanta, she realizes that there is blood spatter and smear on the side of the car. And that is really concerning to her.
I looked down and then I saw the shell cases and my heart got to pumping real fast.
She knows in that moment that something is terribly wrong.
Cobb County, Georgia police respond to a 911 call from Lestine Robinson about her boyfriend, Sean Gray.
The call initially came in as a missing person. So Lestine had called in and basically said she can't find her boyfriend.
I gave him all his information, everything that I could think of, from what he had on to his ID. I had all this stuff to his social security number.
Detectives asked when Lestine last saw Sean.
Right before they were about to doze off to go to sleep, Sean remembered that he left his bottle of water in their rental car. So he decided to get up out of bed and go back down to the parking garage.
They took my report and I walked them downstairs and I showed them where we was parked at.
There's blood in the parking deck near the vehicle, as well as shell casings. The water that Sean went down for was still inside the vehicle.
There was cash in the vehicle. I don't want a ton or anything, but there was cash in the vehicle on the floor.
The vehicle was locked and there was no damage to it. Immediately upon finding the shell casings as well as the blood, officers are taping off that scene, but we still don't necessarily know, was this a homicide? Was this a kidnapping?
We searched the car, took pictures of it, processed it, did everything we could to see if there was any fingerprints or anything on it. We didn't find anything. There was blood on the other side of the wall, and I believe that's where all of the blood that we really saw in the parking deck.
One of the police officers happens to look over the edge of the parking garage and notices a body on the ground, on the embankment, lying there.
Before they can escort her away, Lestine sees him too.
I had saw Sean laying there, and he was laying there, stretched out, flat face on the ground. And at that moment, I felt like I lost everything. I couldn't even breathe.
Sean is pronounced dead at the scene. Closer inspection of his body reveals 4 gunshot wounds. This is a homicide.
Their next step was to question Lestine
Obviously knows is a murder investigation.
about what exactly was going on in their relationship the night of Sean Gray's disappearance and subsequent death.
So one of the first things we were gonna wanna know is, what was your timeline of events?
Where were y'all coming from?
Lestine was able to tell them that their weekend began when she and Sean drove down from Chicago with her son to celebrate her birthday for the weekend in Atlanta.
So it would have been Lestine, Alram, and Sean. Eventually that evening, they drop Alram off at his grandmother's house. So the next day is January 15th, and that's Lestine's actual birthday. So that morning, they go sightseeing.
They go back to the hotel, and I guess they had started partying a little bit. She ends up drinking too much, and she stays in that night. Sean goes out by himself, and he went to strip clubs.
The night before, he went to Magic City that Friday night. I didn't go with him Friday night.
The next morning, January 16th, this is now Saturday, and Lestine is extremely hungover. So they actually stay in bed almost the entire day, not leaving the hotel until around 6 o'clock in the evening.
They go have a great time, hit some clubs, get back to the hotel around 3 a.m.
We stopped at the gas station before we got here. We got out the car and got on the elevator, came up the stairs. I came in the room, he drank the juice, he had the apple juice. I got ready to get in the shower. He said he was going to the car to get the water. That's the last time I heard from him. He never came back.
After their interview with Lestine, detectives asked the hotel for the security camera recordings.
They go with the general manager to start reviewing the surveillance video.
Lestine and Sean, they park their car, and you see another car drive by and park around the way. Lestine and Sean go get in an elevator, and they go up to their room. A little bit later, you actually see somebody walking along the wall of the parking deck, and they pass all these other cars, and they go up to Sean's car, his rental car. And they look inside the windows, and then they duck back behind the vehicle.
At 3:32 a.m., Sean walks back down to the car, and he's almost at his door when you actually see him kind of take a step back and look under the vehicle as though he heard something. Around that time, you see an individual coming out on the passenger side of his vehicle, and at some point, they are actually face to face. And you can't tell whether any words are exchanged at that time, but they are staring at each other dead in the eyes for several seconds before Sean takes another step or two towards his vehicle.
That's when the shooter, he actually had his gun down by his leg already. When he came out, pulls it up and starts shooting.
You see Sean run and actually jump that small barricade as this individual is continuing to fire at him and actually reaches over the barricade to fire off several more rounds as Sean is trying to flee.
As the suspect is running away, you see this red Toyota Corolla pull up, stop. The suspect runs up to the door, pulls on it, gets in with a gun in his hand, and they drive off out of the parking deck.
No property was taken from Sean. He still had his wallet on his person when he was discovered. This is absolutely a targeted murder. It's clear from the evidence that this is targeted. So why Sean? Why Sean Gray?
Was given Cobb County detectives their first lead in the murder of Sean Gray. They think they're after at least two people, the shooter and the getaway driver.
So this was a very lucky case in the sense that officers were able to get a perfectly clear image of the tag of the red vehicle. Almost immediately, law enforcement is running the tag of that red vehicle, and it comes back to a woman who lives in Atlanta.
On the video, both the shooter and the driver appear to be men, so authorities focus on the registered owner's address.
So we look for every male that's associated with that address, and we find one guy that's old enough to be involved, to be as old as that guy was, and his name happens to be Ashley Davis. Once we had him identified, we took an arrest warrant. We started calling for assets to pick him up. But every SWAT team, the Marshal Service, Georgia State Patrol, anybody that could actually serve that arrest warrant for us, help us out, were all tasked out to the Capitol. They believed that there was going to be riots at the Capitol because of the election. So we actually had to wait 4 days.
Authorities used the time to learn more about Davis.
Investigators are able to use social media pages for their investigations. They're able to determine who people are communicating with, who their friends are, where they might have been at certain times and dates.
We know that our victim was from Chicago, had never been to Atlanta before. So Detective Knight is going through Ashley Davis's Facebook account to figure out what connection he might have to Chicago.
All of his little Facebook friends, all of his posts, there's one single connection with somebody from Chicago, and it's Jay Bracey. I don't know what his real name is, anything like that. So I reached out to some of the jurisdictions up around North Chicago area. I actually got in touch with one of their crime analysts. I sent them Jay Bracey's Facebook page.
While the Chicago crime analyst works on identifying Jay Bracey, authorities in Georgia finally take Ashley Davis into custody.
So January 21st, Ashley Davis is actually picked up by U.S. Marshals. He's brought to Cobb County Police Headquarters for an interview.
He claims he had nothing to do with the shooting.
Me and my girl were beefing, and she went out and mess with us to do it. I went out and tried to find, I ain't gonna lie, I was trying to solicit.
Okay.
I'm not even gonna lie.
So,
Do you remember being in Cobb County? No, actually, at that time, no.
Investigators get a search warrant for Davis's phone and find more incriminating evidence.
We do a phone extraction. And in doing so, Detective Knight noticed that there was some text message exchange around the time of our homicide where Ashley Davis is texting someone who's saved in his phone as Jay Chi-Town.
You start looking in the thread of those text messages between Ashley and this Jay number. And you see there's screenshots from the B-Way crew page where they've just arrived in Atlanta.
There's a picture taken from the Courtyard Marriott where Sean Gray was staying and was discovered. Why is Jay Chi-Town sending a text of this screenshot from Facebook to Ashley Davis?
Gang squads in Chicago and Atlanta are not aware of the B-Way crew. So what is their connection?
In that extraction of Ashley's phone, probably 2.5 hours after the murder, you see him text Jay Chi-Town, "Hey, dump the line."
We found out that meant change your phone number, get rid of that phone line and get a new phone number. There was also several text messages about a tracker and where particular individuals were. And that really got Detective Knight's attention.
They had said delete the app with the tracker, made me think there was a GPS tracker. I saw the surveillance video where he's behind the car, so at that point we're like, maybe he was putting it on or taking it off, or I don't know.
By now, the crime analyst in Chicago thinks they have identified the man known as Jay Chi-Town and Jay Bracy. It could be a man named Jamar Bracy.
Jamar's actually served time in the Illinois State Penitentiary up there, and he's living in the Atlanta area now with his brother.
If Jamar Bracy and Ashley Davis were involved, who was the driver and who was the shooter? Now that they have a name, investigators dig into Bracy's phone records.
So we know we want a court order for those cell phone records, and we want to know where that device was at the time of our homicide.
Let's see, he's got location history right near where the victim is killed. And I also see he has location history where a gas station was, where I know my victim was. We found a car in his name, tag number, and we ran that tag number through our license plate reader system. And on the day that the victim got to town, Jamar Bracy's car was seen on tag readers in Cobb County around that hotel multiple times for several hours in that area.
Jamar Bracy was sitting at that hotel from 1 a.m. on Friday, January 15th until about 11:45 a.m. So you're talking about 10 and a half hours.
Who does that? Someone who is absolutely positively obsessed.
A haunting clue comes when analysts study Bracy's social media.
On a Facebook post he made just after the murder, he said, "Hurt me, I'll let karma do its job. Hurt my family, I'll become karma."
Cobb County detectives now have two suspects in the murder of Sean Gray, Ashley Davis and Jamar Bracy. They hope Sean's girlfriend, Lestine Robinson, can help them understand the mysterious B-Way crew.
I asked her to come in for another interview. I asked her to go through the timeline again, which she did exactly the same as she did before. Oh, she's very, very consistent.
Your son, you go by like Broadway something?
B-Way crew, it's like 6 of them on that Facebook page.
Lestine explains the B-Way crew is a small group her son Alram created with friends back in Chicago, and it seems Jamar Bracy had it out for them.
I did a search warrant on their Facebook page. In that search warrant, I got their message contents. And one of the conversations was between the B-Way crew page and Jay Bracy. Jay Bracy messages them, hey, I need to know who shot my nephew.
Turns out there was a drive-by shooting in Chicago on January 6th, 11 days before Sean was killed.
Chicago Police Department informs Cobb County Police that drive-by shooting involved 16-year-old Brandon Walker being shot in the neck. Brandon Walker is actually Jamar Bracey's nephew. Although there is some significant and permanent damage, he does end up surviving.
Jamar Bracey wanted to find all of the correlations and all of the potential players that may have been involved in this drive-by on his nephew.
The messages reveal Bracey believed the B-Way crew and Lestein's son, Alram, were tied to the drive-by when he saw a photo Alram posted that showed the apartment complex where the shooting took place.
Now, Alram was a big Facebooker, and prior to him and his mother and Sean moving out to Libertyville, Illinois, he took a picture of his mother's front door in his old neighborhood and posted it to Facebook.
Seeing that photo, Bracey messaged Alram to confront him.
Alram vehemently denied having anything to do with the drive-by shooting, telling Jamar that he had moved from that apartment complex, he was not there, he has no idea who was involved with it.
Authorities also find messages sent to Alram by Jamar Bracey's sister, Kirby Bracey Walker, the mother of the drive-by shooting victim.
Kirby Walker did reach out to Alram on Facebook to question him about what exactly happened the night of the drive-by as well.
They're responding saying, we used to live there. Why would we shoot up our former residence? That doesn't make any sense.
But then Jamar began questioning him about, well, if you didn't do it, who did? I need their information. I want to contact them. I need to know who was involved in this drive-by.
At that point, B-Way crew was like, yo, man, pump the brakes. You're asking way too many questions. I'm out. I don't want to have this conversation anymore.
So Alram quits responding, just chalks it up to a weird interaction, and keeps using Facebook like normal.
The Facebook warrant also reveals Alram was the one who posted the photo outside the hotel, never realizing what Bracey might do with it.
Not even an hour after Sean, Lestein, and Alram arrive at the hotel, Jamar Bracey sends that screenshot of the post that they've arrived in Atlanta to Ashley Davis. So now Detective Knight sees, okay, some sort of shooting happened in January of 2021, about 11 days before our murder, and all of a sudden Jamar Bracey is in Atlanta committing a murder of this guy, Sean Gray, who's from Chicago. So how does this fit together?
Investigators think that when Jamar couldn't get information from Alram, he decided to target him.
Jamar now feels like he needs to get to the bottom of what happened.
He was fueled by revenge, and he was gonna get payback for his nephew.
Investigating the murder of Sean Gray, Georgia police believe the getaway driver was Ashley Davis, whom they have in custody. Now, they're after the alleged shooter, Jamar Bracey.
Detective Knight took an arrest warrant for Jamar Bracey, charging him with the murder of Sean Gray. And on February 24th of 2021, U.S. Marshals located him in North Carolina, where he was taken into custody.
I went to DeKalb County and interviewed him at the jail, which once I started asking him about Cobb County, he said he didn't have anything he wanted to talk about and asked for a lawyer.
I don't know if I should be doing this. Should I have a lawyer?
That's up to you, man.
Yeah, I think I want a lawyer.
You don't want to talk to me, cool, whatever. But I'm going to listen to your jail calls anyway. And you say some interesting things on there, like talking about his blood, which is Ashley Davis.
Hey, do me a favor. No. All my social medias, don't get in no inboxes on them. Don't make no comment, don't talk about nothing. Yeah. Yeah. They trying to put a first-degree murder on me just from free blood of post. I'm gonna sue the shit out of these.
And at one point, he gives his Google account information.
At this point, Detective Knight got a court order for Jamar Bracey's Google records. If you have an Android device, you're required to have a Gmail account in order to set up the phone. And from there, Google is tracking everything that you do. In going through those Google records, we also find an email from Optimus. Now, Optimus is a company that provides tracking services, and they have an app associated where you can actually be keeping tabs of the tracking device, seeing where it is on your cell phone. So we see an email where Jamar Bracey is actually signing up for that tracking service.
It took me about a week and I got a search warrant for Optimus GPS tracking and all their history.
The police were able to determine that Lestine and Sean's vehicle had been being tracked since the day after they arrived in Atlanta.
Al Rom is the one that posted on B-Way Crew saying, "We in the A," indicating that Sean, Lestine, and Al Rom had arrived in Atlanta. Jamar Bracey was hunting them. What he didn't realize is that Al Rom went to stay with his grandmother and he ended up stalking Lestine and Sean instead. Jamar Bracey put the Optimus tracker on the vehicle rented by Sean Gray. Jamar Bracey is tracing and stalking and hunting our victim every step of the way.
At one point, Bracey thinks he might have been spotted, so he has Ashley Davis drive him in Davis's mother's car.
That evening, on Saturday, January 16th, Jamar Bracey again goes to Ashley Davis's residence. And it's there that they get in the vehicle together and actually follow behind physically for 3.5 hours Sean Gray and Lestine Robinson.
On the way back to their hotel, Sean and Lestine stop for gas.
I was like, I have to go to this gas station. I gotta see if we got some video here. So I get there and sure enough, I get video of Sean Gray pulling up in his Mitsubishi Outlander. He gets out and he checks the car and he goes inside the gas station. He buys his Voss water. He goes back out to the car. Right about when he's getting in the car, here comes Ashley Davis.
Jamar Bracey and Ashley Davis were sitting right next to Sean and Lestine at the gas pumps minutes before he was murdered.
And right when they pull up, Sean drives off.
At this point, it's about 3:11 in the morning, and they are heading back now to the hotel, which is right around the corner from that Marathon gas station. At 3:21 a.m., you then see this red sedan pull into the parking deck.
When Sean comes back to his car at 3:30 a.m., he is met with Jamar Bracey pulling a gun, firing on him in cold blood.
I had told him I wasn't gonna fall asleep, but I ended up falling asleep. He was coming right back, so I thought. But the whole time, my man was laying just on the opposite of the hotel, dead.
The records show Bracey reached out to his sister right after the shooting.
13 minutes after this murder, Kirby Bracey Walker texts her brother Jamar Bracey and says, "Erase everything, bro. Get home safe. I love you."
Investigators considered charging Bracey's sister as an accessory, but instead, they get her to agree to testify against him.
But he ended up getting charged with malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, and then aggravated assault and the possession of a firearm.
The question is whether the evidence will be enough to convict Bracey.
A defense team only really has to interject doubt into the minds of the jurors. They don't necessarily have to prove their case. All they have to do is interject reasonable doubt into the jurors' minds.
Months after their arrests, Ashley Davis and Jamar Bracey are set to stand trial for the murder of Sean Gray.
Jamar Bracey's defense attorneys filed a speedy trial demand, and with that means Jamar Bracey and Ashley Davis as co-defendants are going to trial together in September.
Weeks before the trial, Davis surprises everyone by pleading guilty.
Evidently, Ashley was afraid of Jamar. He did not want to speak about Jamar. He didn't want to talk about it. And he even asked to go into protective custody at the jail. Ashley did plead guilty. He got a life sentence. Jamar refused to take any deal and decided he wanted to go to trial.
Trial began on September 13th, 2021 at the Cobb County Superior Courthouse.
Jamar never made one eye contact with me, not one. He never looked at me. He held his head down the whole time.
The key piece of evidence for the prosecutors was the surveillance video from the hotel cameras the night that Sean Gray was killed.
Nobody doubted what the video showed, but we really needed evidence to show that the person on video was Jamar Bracey. It was clearly such a targeted murder that you want to know why. And it almost doesn't make sense if you don't know why.
So the goal of the prosecution was not just to make sure that they painted Jamar Bracey as the man that was actually on the surveillance video the night that Sean Gray was killed. They wanted to make sure that the jury had the full picture of Jamar Bracey as a man who was very determined to exact revenge.
I really wanted an expert to be able to show the overlay between all of these records to show how Ashley Davis and Jamar Bracey were truly stalking and hunting Sean Gray. So the expert we hired was actually able to put together an animation that showed the Optimus tracker records coupled with Ashley Davis's records and Jamar Bracey's records. And it was almost like a cat and mouse game where you would see the Optimus tracker moving along, and at the same time, right behind the Optimus tracker were Ashley Davis and Jamar Bracey. This was absolutely a revenge killing where he hunted and stalked Sean Gray, ultimately leading to his death.
But the aim of Bracey's revenge was off.
His amateur sleuthing led him to the wrong person. He had no idea that Sean Gray was not Al Rom and was not any member associated with B-Way Crew. He never cared to put two and two together.
Bracey's lawyers present a different theory, one meant to plant a crucial seed of doubt.
Jamar Bracey had a twin brother, and during the defense, they wanted to allude to the fact that perhaps Jamar Bracey's twin brother had his cell phone during this time period. They didn't want to go as far as saying Jamar Bracey's twin brother committed the murder, but they certainly were trying to get the phone out of Jamar Bracey's hand.
I guess it was their case to say that Jamar wasn't the person who committed the murder, but the jurors did not buy anything that he was selling.
On an ordinary Friday evening in London, people were doing what people have always done in great cities. Some were rushing to meet friends before sunset. Some were finishing another week of work, already thinking about dinner, music, laughter, and the comfort of familiar streets. Market vendors called out to passing customers. Children tugged at their parents' hands. Conversations drifted through crowded sidewalks without anyone imagining that, within moments, those ordinary sounds would disappear beneath panic. Fear rarely announces itself. It does not arrive wearing a uniform or carrying a warning sign. Sometimes it sits quietly in plain sight, unnoticed among shopping bags, backpacks, and forgotten belongings. Sometimes it waits in places where people expect nothing more than another routine afternoon. In the spring of 1999, London became the target of a campaign designed with a chilling purpose. The bombs were not intended to strike military buildings or government offices. They were placed where everyday life unfolded. Busy streets. Neighborhood markets. A welcoming pub filled with people celebrating who they were. The goal was not simply to injure. The goal was to convince entire communities that nowhere was truly safe. Over just 13 days, 3 separate explosions would leave families shattered, hundreds of lives permanently changed, and an entire nation asking how one individual could transform ordinary places into scenes of unimaginable suffering. For many Londoners, those locations had always represented something larger than geography. Brixton was more than a district in South London. It was home to generations of Black British families, musicians, entrepreneurs, churchgoers, students, and immigrants whose stories had become part of the city's identity. Brick Lane was more than a famous street lined with restaurants and shops. It was a symbol of resilience for the Bangladeshi community, where families had built new lives despite hardship and discrimination. The Admiral Duncan was more than a neighborhood pub. It was a place where members of the LGBTQ+ community could laugh openly, celebrate friendships, and briefly forget a world that had not always accepted them. Each location represented people who had already endured prejudice. Each location represented communities that had fought to belong. Someone had chosen them deliberately. The attacks did not happen by accident. They followed a pattern that investigators would only fully recognize after innocent people had already paid the price. The victims never knew they had been selected simply because of where they gathered. A couple shopping for groceries. Friends sharing drinks after work. Parents walking through a crowded market. Workers heading home. Tourists taking photographs. No one wakes up expecting to become part of history. Yet history often begins with ordinary mornings. London in April 1999 felt alive with possibility. The city was changing. Different languages mixed together on busy sidewalks. Music from countless cultures echoed through open shop doors. Restaurants served recipes carried across continents. New generations were growing up believing diversity was becoming one of Britain's greatest strengths. Not everyone welcomed that future. Hidden behind closed doors, isolated from the people he hated, one young man had spent years feeding an obsession. He absorbed extremist propaganda, embraced racist conspiracy theories, and convinced himself that violence could reverse the changes he feared. His beliefs became increasingly detached from reality, shaped by hatred and reinforced by fantasies of provoking chaos between communities that had done nothing to him. His name would soon become known across Britain. But before the headlines, before the trial, before psychologists tried to understand how his worldview had become so dangerously distorted, there were only strangers going about ordinary lives. That is where this story truly begins. Not with the bomber. With everyone else. Because terrorism is often remembered through the name of the person responsible, while the people whose lives were forever altered slowly fade into footnotes. This story refuses to let that happen. Behind every injury was someone whose future suddenly divided into 2 chapters, before the explosion and after it. Before, there were birthdays still being planned, children waiting at home, careers just beginning, relationships growing stronger, dreams so ordinary they barely seemed worth mentioning. Afterward, there were surgeries, nightmares, rehabilitation, funerals, silence where laughter had once been. Some survivors carried visible scars that would never completely heal. Others carried wounds that could not be seen at all. Loud noises became unbearable. Crowded places felt threatening. Forgotten bags in train stations triggered racing hearts. Everyday routines became constant reminders of how quickly life could change. The physical damage was devastating. The psychological damage spread even further. Communities that had spent decades building trust suddenly found themselves asking difficult questions. Was this the beginning of something larger? Would there be another attack? Who would be targeted next? Fear travels faster than any explosion. It moves from person to person, neighborhood to neighborhood, transforming suspicion into habit. Parents became more protective. Police patrols increased. Unattended bags became impossible to ignore. The city continued moving, but something invisible had changed beneath the surface. Investigators faced another frightening possibility. If the attacks were connected, then the person responsible was almost certainly preparing again. Every passing day without an arrest meant another opportunity. Another crowded street. Another forgotten package. Another family whose lives could be destroyed without warning. The clock was already ticking. What detectives did not yet fully understand was that they were pursuing an offender who believed the attacks were only successful if they provoked wider conflict. The violence was intended to spread beyond the immediate victims. Every explosion was meant to deepen divisions, inflame prejudice, and convince different communities that coexistence itself was impossible. It was an ideology built upon dehumanization. It depended on reducing neighbors to enemies. It depended on convincing one man that mass suffering served a greater cause. History has repeatedly shown the terrible consequences of extremist thinking when it goes unchallenged. Hatred rarely appears fully formed. It grows gradually through isolation, misinformation, prejudice, and the repeated rejection of another person's humanity. By the time violence emerges, countless smaller steps have already been taken. This case became one of the clearest reminders that terrorism does not always originate from organized networks operating across borders. Sometimes it grows quietly inside a single individual who convinces himself that innocent strangers deserve to become symbols rather than human beings. The explosions lasted only seconds. Their consequences have lasted decades. Nearly everyone remembers where they were when they first heard the news. Fewer remember the names of those whose futures ended that day, or the hundreds who continued living with permanent injuries long after television cameras disappeared. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Not because of the man who tried to spread hatred, but because compassion, resilience, and solidarity ultimately proved stronger than fear. This is the story of 13 days that tested one of the world's greatest cities, of communities deliberately targeted because of who they were, of investigators racing against time before another attack could happen, and of families whose ordinary lives were forever interrupted by an ideology built on violence. It is also a reminder that behind every headline is a human life, and behind every statistic is a name, a face, and a future that mattered. Before we examine the investigation, the evidence, and the man responsible, we must first understand the city he sought to wound and the people who refused to let hatred define it. The first blast did not only scatter metal. It scattered certainty. For generations, cities like London had survived wars, bombings, political unrest, and moments of national grief. Yet the danger most people imagined usually came from distant conflicts or organized groups whose names dominated newspaper headlines. Few imagined that one young man, acting alone, could move quietly through familiar neighborhoods carrying enough hatred to leave hundreds of strangers forever connected by tragedy. That illusion would soon disappear. The attacks unfolded so closely together that each new explosion erased any hope that the previous one had been an isolated act. With every passing week, the city seemed to lose another layer of innocence. Places once associated with community and celebration became reminders of vulnerability. But that was exactly what the attacker wanted. His objective extended beyond physical destruction. Every nail packed inside each homemade device represented an attempt to multiply suffering long after the explosion itself had ended. Every carefully selected location reflected a deliberate attempt to target people because of their identity rather than anything they had done. The attacks were designed to send a message rooted in racism, hatred, and fear. Yet the message London ultimately received was not the one he intended. Before investigators identified a suspect, something remarkable happened. Neighbors looked after neighbors. Blood donation centers received volunteers. Restaurants prepared meals for emergency workers. Community leaders stood together in public, refusing to allow suspicion to divide them. In Brixton, people comforted complete strangers. In Brick Lane, shopkeepers checked on nearby businesses before worrying about damaged storefronts. In Soho, survivors who had escaped with minor injuries stayed behind to help others whose wounds were far more severe. Acts of violence often make headlines. Acts of kindness rarely do. But those quiet moments would become just as important as the investigation itself. Emergency responders entered scenes they could never have prepared for. Smoke drifted through crowded streets. Broken glass reflected flashing blue lights. Shoes without owners lay scattered across the pavement. Personal belongings, shopping bags, jackets, photographs, children's toys were suddenly transformed into evidence, frozen exactly where frightened hands had dropped them. For paramedics, every second mattered. For police officers, every unexploded object became a potential threat. For families waiting by telephones, every unanswered call stretched into an eternity. No one yet knew how many more attacks might follow. The uncertainty proved almost as frightening as the explosions themselves. Across London, commuters began noticing unattended bags with new suspicion. Train announcements reminding passengers to report suspicious items suddenly carried greater weight. Conversations in cafes turned toward rumors, speculation, and unanswered questions. Who was responsible? Why these neighborhoods? Would there be another bomb tomorrow? Or today? The investigation had barely begun, but the psychological impact had already spread far beyond the immediate victims. Terrorism seeks to alter ordinary behavior, replacing confidence with hesitation and familiarity with doubt. For a time, many Londoners found themselves scanning crowds more carefully, watching exits more closely, and wondering whether normal life had quietly become something else. Unknown to them, detectives were beginning to assemble fragments of a puzzle that seemed both baffling and deeply unsettling. The attacks shared characteristics too specific to ignore. Similar construction. Similar methods. Similar choices of location. Each new discovery suggested planning rather than impulse. Someone had devoted considerable time to preparing these devices, selecting targets, and moving through the city without attracting attention. Whoever this individual was, he had blended into everyday life. Perhaps someone had walked past him moments before an explosion. Perhaps someone had held a door open for him. Perhaps he had stood silently among the very people he intended to harm. That possibility disturbed investigators almost as much as the attacks themselves. Because monsters rarely announce themselves. More often, they buy train tickets, stand in queues, exchange polite greetings, and disappear into crowds until the moment they choose to act. As Britain prepared for another weekend, few realized that the most dangerous phase of the story was still ahead. The first attack had shattered confidence. The second would deepen fear. The third would leave scars that history could never completely erase. And somewhere in the city, while police officers worked around the clock and communities struggled to make sense of what had happened, the man responsible was already thinking about his next destination. He believed he was shaping history. Instead, he was about to become a reminder of how destructive extremist ideology can be and how resilient ordinary people can remain in its aftermath. That journey, from the first explosion to the search for answers, begins with understanding the city itself, its neighborhoods, its diversity, and the communities deliberately chosen as targets. Only then can the full weight of what happened during those 13 days truly be understood. History often remembers attacks by their dates. Investigators remember them by evidence. Survivors remember them by moments. A glance exchanged across a crowded street. A half-finished conversation. The smell of fresh coffee drifting from a nearby cafe. The weight of shopping bags cutting into tired hands. The sound of someone laughing only seconds before everything changed. Trauma has an unusual relationship with time. For those who live through it, the memory rarely unfolds like a movie. It returns in fragments. A flash of sunlight reflecting from a shop window. A sudden silence that lasted no more than a heartbeat. The impossible realization that something was terribly wrong before the mind could even understand what had happened. Many of the people caught in those explosions would later struggle to remember the sequence of events. They remembered faces. They remembered screams. They remembered reaching instinctively for loved ones. But the exact order of those moments became blurred, swallowed by shock. That is the hidden cost of terrorism. Long after broken buildings are repaired and headlines disappear, memory itself becomes another casualty. Years later, survivors would still describe ordinary sounds: a slammed car door, fireworks during summer festivals, construction work echoing through city streets, as unexpected reminders of those spring afternoons in 1999. Their bodies reacted before their minds could reassure them that they were safe. Healing, they learned, was not a straight path. Some physical wounds closed within weeks. Others required months of surgery and rehabilitation. Psychological wounds ignored calendars altogether. They resurfaced unexpectedly, sometimes years later, in places completely unrelated to the attacks themselves. This is why reducing such events to statistics alone never tells the full story. 3 people lost their lives. Around 140 others were injured. Those numbers are accurate. They are also profoundly incomplete. Behind every figure was a family suddenly navigating hospital corridors instead of weekend plans. A partner waiting outside an operating room. Parents unable to answer impossible questions from frightened children. Friends staring at televisions, desperately searching news footage for familiar faces. Entire futures changed in less time than it takes to read a single sentence. The attacks also challenged something less visible but equally important: trust. Cities depend upon countless invisible agreements between strangers. We trust the person standing beside us on a train. We trust that crowded markets are places of commerce rather than violence. We trust that public spaces belong equally to everyone, regardless of race, religion, or identity. When terrorism strikes, those quiet assumptions begin to fracture. People start looking twice. They hesitate. They wonder. Not because they want to fear one another, but because fear quietly rewrites habits that once seemed permanent. And yet London refused to surrender entirely to that fear. The neighborhoods chosen as targets had endured hardship before. Brixton had experienced decades of social change and racial tension, yet it remained defined by resilience rather than division. Brick Lane carried the history of immigrant families who had built new lives through perseverance, transforming struggle into community. Soho had long represented freedom for people who often found acceptance difficult to find elsewhere. Each community had already learned an important lesson before 1999. Identity could be a source of strength rather than weakness. That lesson would soon be tested more severely than anyone imagined. As investigators searched for answers, another battle unfolded beyond the crime scenes. Political leaders urged calm. Religious leaders condemned hatred. Community organizations encouraged solidarity instead of suspicion. Ordinary citizens attended vigils not because they shared the same background, but because they shared the same city. The attacks had attempted to separate people into categories. London answered by standing together. That response did not erase grief. It did not undo injury. But it denied the attacker the deeper victory he had hoped to achieve. The story you are about to hear is therefore not only an investigation into 3 bombings. It is also an examination of an ideology built upon prejudice, isolation, and conspiracy, and of the countless ordinary people who unknowingly stood against it simply by refusing to abandon one another. Over the next chapters, we will walk through streets that appeared perfectly ordinary until violence interrupted them. We will meet individuals who left home expecting nothing more than another normal day. We will follow detectives working under immense pressure as each passing hour increased the possibility of another attack. We will examine the warning signs that existed long before the bombs exploded, asking difficult questions about radicalization, hate, and the circumstances that allowed one individual to move from extremist beliefs to acts of mass violence. Most importantly, we will remember those whose names deserve to be spoken long after the perpetrators has faded into history. Because true crime is not ultimately about the person who commits violence. It is about understanding its consequences. It is about recognizing the humanity that violence tries to erase. And it is about ensuring that remembrance belongs first to those who endured the greatest loss. This is the beginning of that journey. If there is one lesson woven through every chapter of this case, it is that hatred rarely begins with violence. Violence is the final act. Long before a bomb is assembled, long before a target is chosen, long before emergency sirens echo through city streets, something else has already taken root. An idea. A prejudice left unchallenged. A belief that some lives matter less than others. Over time, those beliefs harden, feeding on isolation, misinformation, and resentment until empathy is slowly replaced by contempt. Most people who encounter hateful ideas never act upon them. Some reject them. Some question them. Some walk away. But on rare occasions, an individual embraces those beliefs so completely that reality itself becomes distorted. Ordinary people are no longer seen as neighbors or strangers. They become symbols, targets, obstacles standing in the way of an imagined future that exists only inside an extremist worldview. That transformation does not happen overnight. Understanding how it happens is one of the central questions in this story. Not because understanding excuses violence. It does not. Understanding exists for a different reason. Because every society hopes to recognize warning signs before another tragedy unfolds. This case forces difficult conversations about radicalization, mental illness, personal responsibility, extremist propaganda, and the dangerous consequences of dehumanization. Those subjects are uncomfortable precisely because they resist simple explanations. There is no single moment that can fully explain why innocent people became victims over those 13 days. Instead, there is a chain of choices, influences, and failures that eventually converged into irreversible harm. As we move deeper into this story, we will remain grounded in documented evidence and established facts wherever possible. Where emotions are described, they reflect accounts shared by survivors, investigators, family members, or reasonable inferences drawn from the circumstances, not imagined heroics or invented dialogue. The goal is not to sensationalize suffering, but to understand its human cost. Because behind every investigation file sits a person whose life cannot be restored. A birthday that was never celebrated. A phone call that was never returned. A future that quietly disappeared. It is easy, years later, to see these events as history. History has a way of smoothing rough edges, compressing weeks into paragraphs and lives into statistics. But for those who lived through April 1999, there was no certainty about what tomorrow would bring. Every news bulletin carried the possibility of another attack. Every crowded public place demanded a second glance. Every unfamiliar bag left unattended became a question no one wanted to answer. That atmosphere of uncertainty cannot be measured in police reports alone. It settled into conversations at dinner tables. It followed commuters onto buses and trains. It lingered in schools, workplaces, pubs, and homes. The city continued moving, because cities always do. But beneath the familiar rhythm, something had shifted. People had become aware of how fragile ordinary life could be. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. The distance between an ordinary afternoon and a national tragedy can sometimes be measured in minutes. A market remains a market until it isn't. A neighborhood pub remains a place of laughter until silence takes its place. A forgotten bag remains invisible until someone notices it too late. This story begins before those moments. Before investigators assembled evidence. Before newspaper headlines filled front pages. Before courtrooms and prison sentences. It begins with a city preparing for another spring, unaware that it was about to face one of the most significant acts of domestic extremist violence in modern British history. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what existed before the explosions, the neighborhoods, the communities, and the ordinary lives that gave those places meaning. Only then can the events that followed be seen not merely as a criminal case, but as a profound human tragedy whose lessons remain relevant decades later. So before we examine the attacks themselves, let us step back into London as it was in April 1999, a city alive with possibility, diversity, contradiction, and hope, standing unknowingly on the edge of 13 days that would leave a permanent mark on its history. London, April 1999. Spring had arrived quietly. The last traces of winter were giving way to longer afternoons, warmer breezes, and parks beginning to fill with families who had spent months waiting for sunlight. Cherry blossoms softened the edges of old brick buildings. Street musicians returned to familiar corners. Outdoor cafes set tables along busy pavements, welcoming office workers escaping fluorescent lights for a few precious minutes beneath an open sky. It was a city built on movement. Every morning, millions of journeys overlapped without anyone noticing. Trains emerged from underground tunnels carrying students, accountants, artists, nurses, construction workers, tourists, and immigrants from every corner of the world. Buses crawled through narrow streets lined with Victorian architecture. Black cabs wove through traffic with practiced confidence, while cyclists threaded carefully between impatient commuters. Each person carried a destination. Each person carried a story. Few ever imagined how closely those stories could intersect with history. London at the end of the 20th century was a city continuously redefining itself. It had long been one of the world's most diverse capitals, but during the 1990s that diversity became even more visible. More languages could be heard in a single morning than many countries would encounter in a lifetime. Family-run grocery stores stood beside centuries-old pubs. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples existed within walking distance of one another. The city's identity was not built from a single tradition but from countless lives woven together over generations. That diversity was not without tension. Britain had spent decades confronting difficult questions about immigration, race, identity, and belonging. Some neighborhoods had experienced discrimination, economic inequality, and periods of unrest. Many families remembered prejudice not as a chapter in history books but as something they had personally endured. Yet despite those challenges, communities continued to grow. Children who had never known another home spoke with unmistakably London accents while carrying family traditions that stretched across continents. Markets offered ingredients from South Asia, the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe within the same block. Festivals celebrated different cultures throughout the year, inviting neighbors to share music, food, and traditions that might once have seemed unfamiliar. To countless residents, this was simply normal life. The city was imperfect, noisy, crowded, and sometimes chaotic. It was also unmistakably alive. Among the neighborhoods that best reflected that spirit was Brixton, in South London. Its streets told stories of migration, resilience, creativity, and perseverance. Independent shops stood beside cafes filled with regular customers who knew each other by name. Music drifted from open doorways, reflecting influences that had shaped generations of Black British culture. The local market was more than a place to buy fresh produce. It functioned as a meeting place where conversations lingered long after purchases had been made. For many residents, Brixton represented home in the fullest sense of the word. Across the city, in the East End, Brick Lane carried a different but equally important history. Generations of Bangladeshi families had established businesses there, transforming the area into one of London's best-known cultural districts. The aromas of freshly prepared curries floated through the streets. Bakeries opened before sunrise. Tailors, grocers, and booksellers greeted familiar customers with quiet routine. New arrivals found support from those who had made the same journey years earlier, creating networks of belonging that helped entire communities flourish. Brick Lane was a reminder that cities are constantly shaped by the people who choose to build lives within them. Further west, Soho reflected another chapter of London's identity. Its narrow streets were filled with theatres, cafes, music venues, bookstores, and pubs where people from different backgrounds gathered after work. Among these places stood venues that had become important spaces for the LGBTQ+ community. At a time when acceptance was still uneven and discrimination remained a reality for many, these establishments offered more than entertainment. They offered a sense of safety, friendship, and the freedom to exist openly among people who understood one another's experiences. To an outsider, these neighborhoods might have appeared completely different. In truth, they shared something essential. Each represented communities that had spent years creating spaces where people could belong. Each reflected the belief that London was strongest not because everyone was the same, but because so many different lives could coexist within a single city. It is impossible to understand the events that followed without first understanding that reality. The attacks that would soon shake Britain were not random acts directed at anonymous crowds. They struck places that carried deep meaning for the communities who gathered there. The consequences extended far beyond physical destruction because they touched locations where identity, culture, and everyday life intersected. For investigators, those choices would eventually reveal a pattern. For the public, that pattern would raise troubling questions about hatred, prejudice, and the motivations behind the violence. But in April 1999, none of those questions had yet entered the minds of the people filling London's streets. Parents hurried children toward weekend activities. Friends arranged to meet after work. Shopkeepers prepared for another busy Saturday. Visitors unfolded paper maps, searching for landmarks long before smartphones made navigation effortless. Life moved with the comforting rhythm of routine. No one could know that within days, familiar places would be remembered not only for their history and community, but also for the resilience they would show in the face of unimaginable violence. Before fear entered those streets, there was simply London, a city of ordinary mornings, ordinary conversations, and ordinary hopes, unaware that its greatest test was about to begin. To understand why these attacks left such a lasting mark on Britain, it is important to understand the atmosphere of the country in 1999. The United Kingdom was approaching the end of a century that had brought extraordinary change. The memories of the Second World War were becoming part of living history rather than daily experience. A new generation had grown up without air raid sirens, blackout curtains, or the constant fear of wartime bombing. London had rebuilt itself into one of the world's leading financial and cultural capitals, attracting people from every continent who hoped to build better lives for themselves and their families. Its diversity was visible everywhere. On the Underground, dozens of languages blended into the steady rhythm of arriving trains. Office workers in tailored suits stood beside students carrying backpacks, tourists studying guidebooks, nurses finishing overnight shifts, and market vendors beginning work before sunrise. The city moved as though every individual journey formed part of a much larger machine, one powered by routine rather than attention. Routine creates comfort. People stop noticing the familiar. The florist arranging flowers outside a small shop. The baker unlocking the front door before dawn. The newspaper vendor stacking fresh editions while exchanging greetings with regular customers. The elderly couple walking the same route every morning. The courier balancing parcels on a bicycle through traffic. Each scene appeared ordinary because it happened every day. That ordinary rhythm would soon become one of the greatest casualties of the attacks. Public confidence is difficult to measure until it begins to disappear. Before April 1999, an unattended sports bag on a busy pavement might have attracted little more than curiosity. Someone may have assumed it had been forgotten by a hurried shopper or a commuter rushing to catch a train. A passerby might even have tried to locate its owner without thinking twice. After the bombings, that instinct changed. Objects once considered harmless became reasons to stop, look, and wonder. Parents instinctively drew children closer. Shopkeepers became more attentive to unfamiliar faces lingering near entrances. Transport staff received increasing reminders about vigilance. Without realizing it, an entire city adjusted its behavior. Those changes did not happen because London had become weak. They happened because violence had interrupted one of the invisible agreements that allows urban life to function. Trust. Cities depend upon strangers trusting one another every single day. Millions of people share buses, trains, sidewalks, cafes, parks, and public squares without knowing the names of those standing beside them. They assume that everyone else is simply trying to reach work, meet friends, buy groceries, or return home after another ordinary day. When that assumption is broken, even briefly, its effects spread much further than the physical boundaries of a crime scene. The attacks challenged something deeper than public safety. They challenged the feeling that ordinary life could remain ordinary. Yet even as uncertainty grew, another side of London revealed itself. Community organizations strengthened their support networks. Faith leaders reached across religious and cultural boundaries to offer reassurance. Volunteers organized assistance for those recovering from injuries and for families suddenly facing unimaginable loss. Medical staff worked long hours treating patients whose lives had changed in an instant. Journalists reported the facts while urging the public to avoid speculation that might deepen existing tensions. The city's response reflected years of living with difference rather than division. That distinction mattered. Because the neighborhoods later targeted were not defined solely by ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation. They were defined by people. Parents preparing school lunches before work. Teenagers saving money for concerts. Grandparents sharing family recipes. Business owners opening shops they had spent decades building. Friends meeting every Friday evening without imagining that one gathering would become unforgettable. History often focuses on institutions, governments, police forces, courtrooms. But history is equally shaped by ordinary citizens whose quiet decisions influence the character of a society. The decision to comfort a stranger. The decision to donate blood. The decision to refuse prejudice when fear makes prejudice seem easier. Those moments rarely appear in official reports. Yet they became part of this story just as surely as forensic evidence and courtroom testimony. Looking back more than 2 decades later, it is tempting to believe the outcome was inevitable, that investigators would identify the offender, that justice would eventually follow, and that the city would recover. But none of those outcomes felt certain in April 1999. Each explosion created new uncertainty. Each passing day without an arrest increased public anxiety. Each unanswered question carried the possibility that another community might soon be placed in danger. That uncertainty formed the backdrop against which detectives, emergency responders, journalists, local leaders, and ordinary citizens were forced to make decisions under immense pressure. Some decisions would save lives. Others would reveal just how difficult it is to prevent violence driven by extremist ideology before it reaches the public. As this story unfolds, the focus will remain not only on what happened, but on the people whose lives intersected with those 13 days. Their experiences transformed a criminal investigation into a national reckoning, one that raised enduring questions about hate, resilience, and the responsibility shared by every society to protect the dignity and safety of all its communities. Only by understanding the city as it stood before the attacks can we fully appreciate what was threatened, what was lost, and what ultimately endured. There was another reason London mattered. It was a city where symbols carried extraordinary weight. A single street could represent generations of migration. A neighborhood market could embody decades of perseverance. A local pub could become a refuge where people who had often faced prejudice elsewhere found acceptance, friendship, and a sense of belonging. These places were woven into everyday life, yet they also stood for something larger than themselves. That is why the locations at the center of this story cannot be understood simply as points on a map. They were living communities. Brixton had become synonymous with creativity, resilience, and the enduring contributions of Black Britons to the cultural life of the city. Music spilled from record shops onto busy sidewalks. Local vendors greeted familiar faces with easy conversation. Children grew up recognizing the market not only as a place to shop but as a place where neighbors looked after one another. The streets carried memories of hardship and renewal in equal measure, reminding residents that communities are built over years through shared experience rather than overnight. Brick Lane reflected another chapter of London's evolving identity. Families who had arrived from Bangladesh had transformed the area through determination and hard work, opening restaurants, grocery stores, clothing shops, cafes, and businesses that became landmarks in their own right. Visitors came for the food, but those who lived there understood that the street represented something much deeper. It was evidence that people separated from their homeland could create another home without abandoning their heritage. Generations grew up balancing two cultures, speaking different languages at school and at home, carrying both identities with quiet confidence. Further west, Soho represented freedom in a different way. Its narrow streets had long attracted artists, performers, musicians, and people searching for spaces where individuality was accepted rather than questioned. For many members of the LGBTQ+ community, certain venues in Soho offered something that could not easily be measured. They offered the simple comfort of existing without pretending to be someone else. Friends celebrated birthdays there, colleagues gathered after work, couples met for first dates, and regulars returned week after week because the faces behind the bar had become familiar over the years. Each of these places had developed its own character. Each welcomed people for different reasons. Yet all three shared one defining quality. They were places where communities came together. That common thread would become tragically significant. In retrospect, the attacks appear connected by an obvious pattern. At the time, however, those connections were far less clear. The people walking those streets were thinking about weekend errands, conversations with friends, family dinners, and the ordinary concerns that fill everyday life. None of them viewed themselves as participants in a story that would later be studied by investigators, journalists, historians, and scholars seeking to understand the nature of domestic extremism. Life rarely announces the moment before it changes forever. The days leading into April 1999 felt unremarkable for most Londoners. Newspapers carried the usual mixture of political debate, sporting results, and local events. Office workers counted the hours until the weekend. Shopkeepers restocked shelves. Students prepared for exams. Tourists photographed famous landmarks beneath unpredictable spring skies. Everything suggested continuity. Nothing suggested catastrophe. That contrast is one of the defining characteristics of many major criminal cases. They often emerge not from extraordinary circumstances but from ordinary ones. The routines that seem so insignificant while they are happening later become impossible to forget because they mark the final hours before lives are divided into a before and an after. Looking back decades later, survivors often describe those ordinary details with remarkable clarity. The route they chose that morning. The weather. The conversation they had before leaving home. The decision to stop at one more shop or meet one more friend. Such memories endure because they belong to the last moments untouched by violence. This story asks us to remember those moments. Not to dwell on fear, but to appreciate what was threatened. The communities at the heart of this case were not defined by tragedy. They were defined by everyday acts of living, working, raising families, building businesses, supporting neighbors, and creating places where people from different backgrounds could feel at home. The attacks interrupted those lives, but they did not erase the values those communities represented. As we move forward, the focus will gradually narrow from the city as a whole to the individuals whose lives became intertwined with these events. We will leave the broad landscape of London behind and begin meeting the people who filled its streets, markets, workplaces, and gathering places. They are not remembered because they sought history. They are remembered because history found them. Only by seeing them first as ordinary people, not as victims, witnesses, or names in a case file, can we begin to understand the full human weight of what unfolded during those 13 days in the spring of 1999. Before the investigation had a suspect, before detectives connected evidence across multiple crime scenes, and before newspapers filled their front pages with questions about who was responsible, there were simply people living ordinary lives. That is where every true story of violence should begin. Not with the person who chose to harm others, but with the people whose futures were interrupted without warning. The victims of the 1999 London nail bombings did not share a single background, profession, or life story. They came from different communities, different generations, and different walks of life. Some were lifelong Londoners. Others had come to the city searching for opportunity. Some were shopping, some were meeting friends, and others were simply passing through places that had always felt familiar. They had one thing in common. None of them knew that, on those spring days, they would become part of one of the most significant domestic terrorist attacks in modern British history. In Brixton, the first people affected were ordinary shoppers, market workers, local residents, and visitors who had filled the neighborhood on a busy Saturday afternoon. The market had long been one of the community's gathering places. People came not only to buy fruit, vegetables, clothing, or household goods, but to see familiar faces, exchange greetings, and spend time together. It was a place where everyday life unfolded in public view. When the explosion occurred, dozens of lives changed within seconds. Some injuries healed over time. Others remained permanent reminders of that afternoon. For many survivors, recovery extended far beyond emergency medical treatment. Physical rehabilitation often lasted months. Emotional recovery proved far less predictable. Ordinary experiences, walking through crowded streets, hearing unexpected loud noises, or noticing unattended bags in public places, could suddenly become sources of anxiety. These reactions were shared by many survivors of traumatic events and reflected the lasting psychological impact of indiscriminate violence. A week later, another community faced the same reality. Brick Lane was known throughout London as a place where generations of Bangladeshi families had built businesses and created a strong sense of belonging. Restaurants, cafes, grocery stores, and clothing shops lined the street, welcoming both local residents and visitors from across the city. On weekends, the area bustled with conversation, commerce, and the familiar rhythm of community life. The second explosion injured more people and deepened a growing fear that the attacks were connected. Residents who had spent years building businesses suddenly found themselves helping the injured, checking on neighbors, and wondering whether the places they loved had been deliberately chosen. Even those who escaped physical injury carried memories of confusion, fear, and uncertainty that would remain long after damaged buildings were repaired. Then came the attack that claimed lives. On the evening of April 30, 1999, people gathered inside the Admiral Duncan in Soho. For many, it was the end of another working week. Friends met for conversation, laughter, and companionship. The pub had become an important social space within London's LGBTQ+ community, offering an environment where people could spend time together openly and comfortably. Among those present were 3 people whose names deserve to be remembered not because of the way they died, but because of the lives they lived. Andrea Dykes was 27 years old. She was expecting her first child. She had come to the pub with friends to enjoy the evening. Her future included not only her own hopes and plans, but also those of the child she was carrying. The attack ended both lives before that future could begin. Nick Moore was 31 years old. Friends and loved ones remembered him as someone whose absence left an immeasurable space in their lives. His death became one of the countless reminders that acts of terrorism do not end with a single victim. Every life lost ripples outward through families, friendships, workplaces, and communities. John Light was 32 years old. Like the others who gathered that evening, he had every reason to believe he was spending time in a place of safety among friends. Instead, his life became one of those forever associated with an act of hatred directed not at anything he had done, but at the community to which the location belonged. Their names are often listed together in official records. History records them as fatalities. Their families remember them as sons, partners, relatives, friends, colleagues, and people whose lives contained countless ordinary moments that never appear in court documents or investigative reports. That distinction matters. Violence has a way of reducing people to numbers. 3 dead. Roughly 140 injured. Statistics help us understand the scale of tragedy, but they can never fully capture its human cost. Every injured survivor had people waiting for them. Every hospital visit brought anxious relatives into emergency departments. Every telephone call carried the possibility of devastating news. Behind each casualty was a network of lives suddenly forced to confront uncertainty. As this story continues, those people remain at its center. The investigation, the forensic evidence, the search for the offender, and the courtroom proceedings all matter. But they matter because they were undertaken in response to harm done to real human beings whose lives possessed value long before they became part of a criminal case. Remembering that truth is essential. It reminds us that the purpose of examining cases like this is not to dwell on violence itself, but to understand its consequences and to honor the people who endured them. For many of those who survived, recovery did not begin when they left the hospital. It began when the crowds disappeared. When television cameras packed away their equipment. When newspaper headlines slowly moved on to other stories. When visitors stopped calling quite as often. That was when the long, private work of rebuilding a life truly started. A serious physical injury changes more than the body. It alters routines that once seemed effortless. Simple tasks can become daily challenges. Returning to work may require months of rehabilitation. Activities that once brought comfort can suddenly feel unfamiliar. Recovery is measured not only in medical appointments and surgical procedures, but also in quiet victories that rarely attract attention: the first walk without assistance, the first journey on public transport, the first visit to a crowded public place after fear has become part of everyday life. The psychological impact was equally significant. Many survivors of traumatic events describe an ongoing awareness of their surroundings that did not exist before. A loud, unexpected noise could trigger a rush of adrenaline. An unattended bag might draw immediate concern. Crowded spaces, once ordinary and unremarkable, could require a level of emotional preparation that others never had to consider. These reactions are well documented among people who have experienced violence. They are not signs of weakness. They are reminders that the mind, like the body, attempts to protect itself after trauma. Families experienced their own form of recovery. Parents watched sons and daughters learn to trust familiar places again. Partners adjusted to new realities shaped by physical injuries or emotional distress. Friends discovered that healing rarely follows a predictable schedule. Some days brought optimism. Others reopened memories that seemed impossible to leave behind. Grief and recovery often exist side by side. For the families of those who lost loved ones, time moved differently. The world outside continued forward. Birthdays arrived. Holidays came and went. New Year's began. Yet every milestone also carried the quiet awareness of someone who should have been present. An empty chair at a family gathering. A name spoken in conversation. A photograph that gradually became more valuable with every passing year. These moments rarely appear in official timelines, but they form an important part of the lasting impact of violent crime. Communities also carried memories of those 13 days. In Brixton, the market eventually returned to its familiar rhythm. Vendors reopened stalls. Customers returned. Conversations resumed. The physical signs of destruction faded, but the memory of what had happened remained part of the neighborhood's shared history. Brick Lane continued to welcome residents and visitors alike. Restaurants once again filled with families and tourists. Shopkeepers reopened their businesses. Yet many who had been present during the attack never completely forgot how quickly an ordinary afternoon had turned into an emergency. Soho remained a place of celebration, creativity, and inclusion. The Admiral Duncan reopened, becoming not only a neighborhood pub but also a symbol of resilience. Its continued presence reflected a determination shared by many within the LGBTQ+ community that fear would not be allowed to define spaces built on acceptance and friendship. This determination appeared in countless quiet acts. People returned to places they loved despite understandable anxiety. Businesses reopened despite financial hardship. Communities organized memorials, offered support, and refused to allow violence to erase the identity of their neighborhoods. Such responses do not erase suffering. They demonstrate resilience in the face of it. The individuals injured during the attacks did not choose to become symbols. Most had begun those days with ordinary plans that never included history, media attention, or public remembrance. Yet their experiences came to represent something larger: the human cost of hatred directed toward entire communities. Their stories remind us that terrorism is measured not only by fatalities but by the countless lives permanently altered in ways that cannot easily be quantified. Scars remain. Some are visible. Others exist only in memory. Both deserve acknowledgement. As we move into the next chapter of this story, the focus shifts from those whose lives were changed to the events that changed them. The ordinary routines of springtime London are about to intersect with deliberate acts of violence, setting in motion an investigation that would unfold with extraordinary urgency. To understand what investigators faced, we must first return to the first attack, not to dwell on the explosion itself, but to examine how an ordinary Saturday afternoon became the beginning of a 13-day campaign that challenged the confidence of an entire city. The people affected by the 1999 London nail bombings were never meant to become part of a historical record. They were not politicians. They were not soldiers. They were not public figures whose names appeared regularly in newspapers. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives in a city where millions of personal stories unfolded every day. That is precisely why their experiences matter. Acts of terrorism often attempt to transform individuals into symbols. The attacker sees only categories, communities, or identities. The person disappears behind a label. A neighborhood becomes a target. A gathering place becomes a message. But the reality of human life is always more complicated. Every person who walked through Brixton, Brick Lane, or the Admiral Duncan carried a world with them. They carried memories. They carried relationships. They carried hopes for the future. The tragedy of the bombings was not only that people were injured or killed. It was that lives filled with possibility were interrupted by someone else's decision to spread hatred. Among those injured were people who had to adapt to circumstances they never expected. Some faced physical challenges that affected the way they worked, traveled, or interacted with the world. Injuries caused by explosive devices can have consequences that continue long after the initial emergency has passed. Recovery may involve repeated medical procedures, rehabilitation, and adjustments to everyday life. But physical recovery tells only part of the story. Many survivors also carried the emotional weight of knowing they had been targeted because of the place they happened to be or the community associated with that place. That realization can create a different kind of wound. It raises painful questions. Why here? Why us? Why did someone decide that our lives were worth attacking? Those questions do not always have simple answers. Extremist violence often depends on creating false divisions between people. It attempts to convince individuals that strangers are enemies, that differences are threats, and that communities cannot coexist. The victims of the London nail bombings represented exactly what extremist ideology tries to reject: a society where different identities and experiences exist side by side. Their lives challenged that ideology simply by existing. A market where different cultures met. A street shaped by immigrant families. A pub where people could gather openly. These were not merely locations. They were examples of communities functioning as they should. For the families of the victims, the aftermath was not measured only by the immediate days following the attacks. It continued through anniversaries, personal milestones, and moments when the absence of a loved one became impossible to ignore. Grief changes over time. The sharpness may soften, but the loss remains. A photograph may become more precious. A familiar song may bring back memories. A place once visited together may carry a different meaning. The passage of time does not remove the importance of the person who is missing. This is why remembrance became such an important part of the aftermath. Memorials, public gatherings, and community events served a purpose beyond honoring those who died. They reminded survivors and families that their experiences had been seen, that their losses mattered, and that the communities targeted by hatred would not allow themselves to disappear. The response from London also revealed something important about the nature of cities. A city is not only its buildings. It is not only its streets, landmarks, or institutions. A city is the relationships between people who share those spaces. When one person is harmed, the impact can travel through that entire network. A shopkeeper helping an injured stranger. A neighbor checking on someone they had never spoken to before. A volunteer offering support. A medical worker staying beyond the end of a shift. These actions rarely become headlines, yet they form the foundation of how communities survive moments of crisis. The victims of the nail bombings were not defined by the violence directed against them. They were defined by the lives they lived before it happened. The places they visited. The people who loved them. The memories they created. The futures they imagined. Remembering this is especially important in a case where so much public attention naturally focused on the person responsible. Investigations require identifying offenders. Courts require examining evidence. History requires understanding causes and consequences. But justice begins with recognizing who was harmed. Before there was a suspect, there were victims. Before there was a trial, there were families waiting for answers. Before there were case files and evidence exhibits, there were people simply trying to live their lives. The next part of this story moves into the events themselves, the moments when familiar streets became crime scenes and investigators began the urgent task of discovering whether these explosions were isolated incidents or part of a larger pattern. Behind every piece of evidence was a reminder of what had been taken away. And behind every investigation decision was the responsibility to prevent more people from suffering the same fate. The first explosion happened on a Saturday afternoon. April 17, 1999. For most people in London, it was the kind of day that carried no warning. A spring weekend. A chance to shop, meet friends, run errands, or simply spend time outside after a long winter. In Brixton, South London, the streets were alive with the familiar energy of the weekend. The neighborhood was known for movement and conversation. People walked between shops and market stalls, carrying bags filled with groceries and everyday purchases. Vendors spoke with customers they recognized. Friends stopped to talk even when they were in a hurry. The sounds of commerce blended with the ordinary background noise of a busy city. Nothing about the scene suggested that the area would soon become the first location in a series of attacks that would shock the country. Among the crowds was an object that appeared out of place. A bag. At first glance, it was the kind of item people might see every day in a crowded urban environment. Londoners were accustomed to forgotten belongings. Bags were left on benches, near shops, or beside market stalls. Most were harmless. Most belonged to someone who would eventually return looking embarrassed and apologetic. But this bag was different. Inside was a homemade explosive device designed to cause maximum injury. The device had been prepared with metal nails intended to become dangerous projectiles when the explosion occurred. The person who placed it there had chosen the location deliberately. The target was not a building. It was not a government office. It was a community. The area had a large Black British population, and the attack was motivated by extremist hatred directed toward that community. The choice of location reflected an attempt to spread fear beyond the immediate scene, to make people question whether they were safe in places where they gathered every day. For those nearby, however, there was no knowledge of the intention behind the object. There was only confusion. An ordinary afternoon was interrupted by uncertainty. People noticed something unusual. The bag drew attention. Some members of the public reacted, attempting to understand what it was and what should be done. In those moments before the explosion, nobody knew they were standing near a deliberate act of violence. Then the device detonated. The explosion transformed the atmosphere instantly. A place filled with routine sounds became a scene of panic. The normal rhythm of the market disappeared beneath shock and confusion. People moved away from the blast area, trying to understand what had happened. Others moved toward the injured, responding instinctively to help. Within moments, emergency services were called. Police officers arrived. Paramedics began treating those who had been hurt. The first priority was simple: save lives. 48 people were injured in the explosion. Some suffered wounds caused by fragments from the device. Others were affected by the sudden force of the blast itself. Many had been caught completely unaware, with no opportunity to protect themselves from what was happening. For emergency responders, the scene presented an immediate challenge. A bombing creates uncertainty beyond the initial damage. There is always the possibility of additional devices. There is the need to secure the area while providing medical assistance. Every decision must balance speed with caution. The response unfolded under pressure. Officers worked to control the area. Medical teams treated victims. Witnesses attempted to describe what they had seen, though memories in moments of extreme shock are often incomplete. Some remembered the object before the explosion. Others remembered only the sudden noise and the realization that people around them were injured. At first, investigators faced the difficult task of determining exactly what had happened. Was it an accident? Was it an isolated criminal act? Was there a larger threat? Those questions would soon become increasingly urgent. The physical evidence began telling a disturbing story. The construction of the device suggested planning rather than chance. The use of nails indicated an intention to increase the number and severity of injuries. This was not a random event caused by carelessness. Someone had prepared this. Someone had placed it among civilians. Someone had chosen a location filled with people. The discovery changed the nature of the investigation immediately. London had experienced terrorism before, but the idea that an individual could place a homemade bomb in a community space and disappear into the city created a different kind of fear. There was no clear organization to identify. No immediate claim of responsibility. No obvious suspect waiting to be found. Only evidence, injuries, and a growing concern that the person responsible might strike again. For the people of Brixton, the impact was immediate. A familiar neighborhood had become associated with violence. A place where people had come to shop and socialize became a location where survivors would later return with memories of the day everything changed. Yet even in those first hours, the response was not defined only by fear. People helped one another. Strangers assisted strangers. Community members supported those who had been injured. The same connections that had made Brixton a living neighborhood also helped it respond to tragedy. But while the injured were being treated and investigators examined the scene, the person responsible remained unknown. And the most frightening possibility had not yet been confirmed. The explosion in Brixton was not the end. It was the beginning. 7 days later, another community would face a similar nightmare. And investigators would begin to realize that they were not looking at a single act of violence, but a pattern that threatened to continue. 7 days after the explosion in Brixton, London had not yet recovered from the shock. The investigation was still developing. Police officers were examining evidence, speaking with witnesses, and trying to understand who could have carried out such an attack. For many residents, the biggest question remained unanswered. Was Brixton a single, isolated incident? Or was someone planning something more? At that moment, there were no clear answers. The city continued moving because cities always do. People returned to work. Shops reopened. Public transport continued carrying millions of passengers. The routines of daily life resumed, even though a new sense of caution had quietly entered the streets. But beneath that appearance of normality, uncertainty remained. Then, on April 24, 1999, another explosion occurred. This time, the location was Brick Lane in the East End of London. Like Brixton, Brick Lane was not simply a street. It was a community shaped by decades of history. The area had become closely associated with London's Bangladeshi population, with families building businesses, creating cultural institutions, and establishing a strong presence in the neighborhood. Restaurants opened their doors to visitors from across the city. Shop owners greeted regular customers. Residents knew the rhythm of the street, the morning deliveries, the afternoon crowds, the evening conversations that continued long after many businesses had closed. It was a place where people came together. And once again, it had been chosen as a target. The device placed there followed a similar pattern to the previous attack. It was homemade, concealed, and designed with the intention of causing widespread injury. The similarities between the two incidents immediately raised serious concerns among investigators. This was no longer simply a question of what had happened in Brixton. The question became, who was doing this? And where would they strike next? Before investigators could answer those questions, The people of Brick Lane experienced the same terrifying uncertainty that had affected Brixton just days earlier. A suspicious package had been noticed. The circumstances surrounding it created concern, and attempts were made to deal with the object before anyone fully understood the danger it represented. Then the device exploded. The attack caused injuries to 13 people. Once again, ordinary people became victims of a crime they had no connection to. They were not involved in conflict. They were not participants in any political dispute. They were individuals caught in a moment of deliberate violence simply because they happened to be near a place selected by someone motivated by hatred. The emergency response began immediately. The area changed from a busy street into a scene of investigation and medical assistance. Police officers worked to secure the location. Emergency personnel treated those who had been injured. Witnesses tried to provide information, describing what they had seen before the explosion and helping investigators reconstruct the sequence of events. But the second attack changed something fundamental. The fear was no longer limited to one neighborhood. The possibility that London was facing a series of connected attacks became impossible to ignore. 2 explosions. 2 communities. Similar methods. Similar timing. The evidence suggested a deliberate campaign. For investigators, this was the moment when the case moved from a single bombing investigation into a wider search for a person who appeared determined to continue. The pressure increased. Every hour mattered. Every piece of information mattered. Every possible lead had to be examined. The attacker had demonstrated that he could move through the city, select targets, prepare devices, and leave before anyone knew who he was. That uncertainty created a unique challenge. Traditional investigations often begin with a relationship between offender and victim. Detectives look for motives connected to personal disputes, financial conflicts, or known enemies. This case was different. The victims were strangers. The locations were symbolic. The motive was ideological. The offender was not seeking revenge against specific individuals. He was attempting to attack entire groups of people based on identity. That made the investigation both more difficult and more urgent. As news of the second bombing spread, communities across London began asking a frightening question. Who might be next? The first attack had already shaken confidence. The second confirmed that the danger had not passed. For members of communities who recognized themselves as potential targets, the fear carried an additional weight. The attacks were not random in the way they first appeared. The locations suggested that people were being targeted because of who they were, where they came from, or how they lived. That realization created anger as well as fear. But it also created solidarity. Leaders from different communities spoke against division. Residents refused to allow suspicion to replace cooperation. People who had never met before found themselves connected by a shared determination not to be separated by violence. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining the evidence left behind. The similarities between the 2 bombs pointed toward the same person. The devices showed signs of planning and preparation. The choice of targets revealed an extremist ideology focused on attacking diversity itself. The investigation was no longer simply about identifying a bomber. It was about preventing another attack. Because if the pattern continued, there was only one certainty. Someone else could be placed in danger. And that possibility became reality just 6 days later. On April 30th, as London prepared for another weekend, the third attack would strike a different community. This time, the location would be Soho. This time, the consequences would be even more devastating. And this time, the investigation would move closer than ever toward the person responsible. By the final days of April 1999, London was living with a fear that had not existed only 2 weeks earlier. The city had entered a strange state of uncertainty. Life continued, but something had changed beneath the surface. People still went to work, still met friends, still traveled across the capital, but there was now a new awareness of vulnerability. The question that had first appeared after Brixton had become impossible to ignore after Brick Lane. Would there be another attack? For investigators, the answer was painfully clear. The evidence suggested that the person responsible was not finished. The first 2 explosions had revealed a pattern. The devices shared similarities. The locations appeared to have been selected because of the communities connected to them. The attacks were not random acts of violence. They were part of a deliberate campaign driven by extremist beliefs. But while police officers analyzed evidence and followed leads, the public still did not know who they were searching for. The offender remained invisible. That uncertainty was one of the most frightening aspects of the case. A person capable of preparing explosive devices had moved through London unnoticed. He had selected crowded areas, left behind objects designed to harm strangers, and disappeared before the consequences became clear. For many people, the danger felt impossible to predict. There was no obvious warning. No confrontation. No opportunity to understand what was happening until it was already too late. Then came April 30th, 1999. The location was the Admiral Duncan pub in Soho. The evening began like many others. The pub was a familiar gathering place within the LGBTQ+ community. Like countless neighborhood venues across London, it was more than a building. It was a place where people met friends, celebrated important moments, and found a sense of belonging. For many members of the community, spaces like this carried special importance. Acceptance was not always guaranteed everywhere. Discrimination and hostility remained realities for many LGBTQ+ people in Britain during the 1990s. Places where people could gather openly and safely represented something valuable, a reminder that they deserved to live without hiding who they were. On that evening, people entered the Admiral Duncan expecting an ordinary experience. They came for conversation, for companionship, for the simple comfort of spending time with others. Among those present were 3 people whose names would later become permanently associated with the tragedy. Andrea Dykes was 27 years old and pregnant. Her death meant that 2 lives were lost, the life she had already lived and the future of the child she was carrying. For her family and friends, the loss represented not only the pain of a person taken away, but also the disappearance of a future that would never arrive. Nick Moore was 31 years old. John Light was 32 years old. Like Andrea, they were not involved in any conflict. They were not participants in any struggle. They were people spending time in a familiar place, surrounded by others, unaware that they had become the targets of an extremist attack. The device exploded inside the pub. The impact was immediate. The attack caused widespread injuries, killing 3 people and injuring 79 others. Emergency responders arrived to a scene of devastation. Medical teams faced the difficult task of treating numerous victims at once, prioritizing the most seriously injured while trying to provide reassurance to those experiencing fear and confusion. For survivors, the moments following the explosion would remain permanently etched in memory. The shock of the blast. The confusion of not immediately understanding what had happened. The realization that people nearby had been seriously hurt. The instinctive human response to help. In disasters, people often remember not only the moment of destruction but also the moments of compassion that follow. Strangers helping one another. People staying with the injured. Individuals placing their own fear aside to assist someone else. Those moments became part of the story too. But for investigators, the third attack represented a devastating confirmation. The person responsible had escalated. The previous bombings had caused injuries. This attack had taken lives. The urgency of finding the offender increased dramatically. The similarities between the 3 incidents now formed a clear picture. The targets reflected extremist hatred toward different communities. The devices showed planning. The timeline suggested confidence and determination. The question was no longer whether the attacks were connected. The question was how quickly investigators could identify the person responsible. In the days that followed, London would search for answers. Forensic specialists would examine evidence. Detectives would trace information from multiple sources. Witness accounts would become increasingly important. The investigation would begin narrowing the distance between the anonymous figure behind the attacks and the individual who had carried them out. But before that happened, the city had to face the immediate reality of what had occurred. 3 communities had been targeted. Hundreds of people had been affected. 3 families had lost loved ones. And countless others had been forced to confront the consequences of hatred directed against them simply because of who they were. The third explosion marked the darkest moment of the 13-day campaign. But it also marked the beginning of the end. Because with each attack, the evidence had grown stronger. And with each piece of evidence, investigators moved closer to discovering the identity of the person who had brought fear to the streets of London. When the explosion at the Admiral Duncan pub ended, the immediate priority was not understanding the motive. It was saving lives. In the first moments after the blast, the scene was defined by confusion. A place that had been filled with conversation and ordinary human connection was suddenly transformed into an emergency zone. People who had arrived expecting a normal evening found themselves trying to understand what had happened, helping those nearby, and searching for friends in the uncertainty that followed. Emergency responders moved quickly. Police officers secured the area. Paramedics treated the injured. Fire and rescue personnel assisted in making the location safe. Every second mattered. But while emergency teams focused on the immediate human cost, investigators began facing another urgent responsibility, determining whether this was an isolated attack or the latest stage of a wider campaign. By this point, the evidence from Brixton and Brick Lane was already creating a disturbing picture. 3 attacks. 3 locations. 3 communities chosen for symbolic reasons. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The first challenge for investigators was reconstructing what had happened. Explosive scenes are among the most complex crime scenes to examine because the evidence is often damaged, scattered, or altered by the very force of the event being investigated. A device designed to destroy can also destroy the clues needed to identify the person who created it. Yet even after the destruction, traces remained. Fragments. Materials. Construction methods. Patterns. Every small piece could potentially answer a larger question. Who made these devices? How were they assembled? Where had the materials come from? How had the person responsible moved through London without being detected? The investigation required cooperation between multiple specialist teams. Officers collected physical evidence while detectives interviewed witnesses and reviewed information from previous attacks. Analysts compared details between the 3 explosions, looking for similarities that could reveal a common source. The pattern that emerged was increasingly clear. The devices had been created using similar methods. They contained nails intended to increase injuries. They appeared to have been prepared by someone with enough knowledge to construct multiple explosive devices. The attacks also shared another important characteristic. The locations appeared carefully selected. This was not a case where victims had been chosen because of personal relationships or individual disputes. The targets reflected communities that the attacker opposed because of extremist beliefs. That distinction changed the entire direction of the investigation. Detectives were not searching for someone with a personal connection to the victims. They were searching for someone motivated by ideology. That type of offender presents a unique challenge. There may be no obvious connection between the attacker and the victims. No argument witnessed by neighbors. No financial dispute. No former relationship to investigate. The motivation exists inside a belief system. A belief system built around hostility. As detectives worked through the evidence, they also faced the enormous task of managing public fear. The attacks had happened in recognizable, everyday places. They had not occurred on a battlefield or in a restricted area. They happened where ordinary people gathered. That reality changed how many Londoners viewed their own city. The investigation was not happening in isolation. Every new development was watched closely by a public desperate for reassurance. Would another attack happen? Was the person responsible still active? Could another community be targeted? These questions increased the pressure on investigators. The third attack had created a new urgency because the offender had demonstrated a willingness to continue. Waiting for another incident was not an option. The search had to move faster. Among the evidence examined were witness statements from people who had been near the scenes. In cases like this, witnesses often provide details that seem insignificant at first. A person seen briefly in the area. A vehicle parked nearby. A small observation that appears unrelated until investigators connect it with other information. Criminal investigations are often built from these small pieces. One observation rarely solves a case alone. But together, fragments can create a complete picture. As detectives continued their work, they also examined the possibility that the offender might have left traces beyond the crime scenes. The preparation required for 3 separate attacks suggested planning, organization, and access to materials. Somewhere behind the public events was a private process of preparation. That process became a critical part of understanding the offender. Because the attacks had not appeared from nowhere. They had a history. They had a beginning. They had a person behind them. The challenge was finding where that person existed within the millions of lives that made up London and its surrounding areas. For the public, the investigation felt uncertain. For detectives, however, the evidence was beginning to create direction. The 3 crime scenes were no longer separate tragedies. They were connected chapters of the same case. And within those chapters were clues that would eventually lead investigators toward a name. A name that would soon become known across Britain. David Copeland. But before that discovery, detectives still had to follow the evidence, examine possibilities, and separate facts from assumptions. The search was only beginning. As investigators continued examining the 3 bombing scenes, one fact became increasingly difficult to ignore. The attacks were not the work of chance. They were connected by intention. At each location, the evidence pointed toward a person who had carefully planned the devices, selected the places where they would be left, and understood the potential consequences of using explosive weapons in crowded public areas. For the detectives assigned to the case, the investigation became a race against time. They were not simply looking backward, trying to understand what had already happened. They were trying to prevent what might happen next. The possibility of another attack remained one of the greatest concerns. The person responsible had already demonstrated a pattern. After the first explosion in Brixton, another followed in Brick Lane. After Brick Lane, the Admiral Duncan attack occurred. Each incident increased the urgency because investigators knew the offender was capable of acting again. The central question was no longer only, who did this? It was also, where will he strike next? That uncertainty placed enormous pressure on every decision. Detectives had to carefully analyze evidence without knowing which details might prove important. In a case involving a homemade explosive device, even the smallest material fragment could become significant. Investigators examined the construction methods, the components used, and the similarities between devices recovered from the scenes. They also studied the choices behind the attacks. The locations themselves provided information. The first 2 targets were associated with ethnic minority communities. The third targeted a venue connected with the LGBTQ+ community. Together, the attacks revealed an ideological motive centered on hatred toward groups of people based on identity. This understanding helped investigators narrow the type of offender they were searching for. They were not dealing with someone seeking money. They were not dealing with someone attempting to escape after a personal dispute. They were dealing with an individual whose motivation came from extremist beliefs. That changed the nature of the search. Investigators began considering the wider environment in which such beliefs could develop. They examined possible links to far-right movements, extremist publications, and individuals who had expressed similar views. At the same time, they had to avoid assumptions. A dangerous ideology does not automatically identify one specific person. Many individuals may hold hateful opinions without committing crimes. The challenge for law enforcement was finding the person whose beliefs had crossed the line into planning and carrying out violence. The investigation required patience. It required comparing information from different sources. It required building a picture from incomplete pieces. Witnesses became an important part of that process. People who had been near the scenes provided descriptions of suspicious activity, objects, and movements. Some details were clear. Others were uncertain. Human memory during frightening events is complicated. A person may remember a sound but not a face. A location but not a time. A small detail that seems unimportant but later becomes valuable when combined with other evidence. Detectives understood that solving the case would not depend on a single dramatic discovery. It would depend on accumulation. One piece. Then another. Then another. Meanwhile, the public reaction continued to grow. The bombings had created fear not only because of the physical damage they caused, but because of the message behind them. The attacks appeared designed to make entire communities feel threatened. People who identified with the targeted groups faced the disturbing realization that they had been attacked because of who they were. Community leaders worked to prevent fear from turning into division. The message repeated across London was clear: the attacks were intended to create separation, but communities would not allow hatred to determine how people treated one another. This response became an important part of the aftermath. The attacker had attempted to use violence to create conflict between groups. Instead, many people responded by emphasizing connection. But while communities focused on supporting one another, investigators continued searching. Behind the scenes, police teams followed leads that would gradually narrow the field of possibilities. They examined information about extremist activity, reviewed evidence from the scenes, and worked to understand how one person could have carried out multiple attacks without being identified. The investigation began moving from a question of what happened toward a more specific question. Who had the ability, opportunity, and motivation to do this? That question would eventually lead investigators away from the anonymous figure they had been pursuing and toward an individual with a documented history of extremist beliefs. But reaching that point required one more crucial element. A connection between the evidence and a person. A bridge between the crime scenes and a suspect. That bridge would come from the details investigators uncovered after the final attack. The final bombing had caused the greatest loss of life. But it also produced the clues that would begin revealing the identity of the person responsible. The investigation was approaching its turning point. The search that had begun in the streets of London was about to move toward a single name. The investigation into the London nail bombings was becoming a search through fragments. Fragments of metal recovered from damaged locations. Fragments of witness memories. Fragments of information about extremist activity. And fragments of a person's own actions that would eventually reveal who was behind the attacks. In the early stages of any major criminal investigation, there is often a period of uncertainty where many possibilities must be considered. Detectives cannot immediately know which information will become important and which will lead nowhere. Every report must be assessed. Every statement must be examined. Every possible connection must be tested. The challenge in this case was even greater because the offender had not left behind an obvious personal motive. There was no argument between individuals. No known relationship between attacker and victims. No personal history that investigators could immediately follow. The victims had been selected because of communities they represented. That meant detectives had to look beyond ordinary criminal patterns. They needed to understand the ideology behind the attacks. The first two bombings had already suggested a racist motive. The final attack at the Admiral Duncan revealed that the hatred extended beyond race and included hostility toward the LGBTQ+ community. The pattern showed an extremist worldview built around rejecting people who did not fit the attacker's beliefs about society. Investigators began examining the possibility that the offender had been influenced by far-right extremist material. This was a period when the internet was beginning to change how people accessed information. Extremist ideas that had previously circulated through limited networks could now spread more easily through online spaces, printed material, and informal groups. For law enforcement, understanding this type of radicalization presented new challenges. The offender did not need to belong to a large organization. He did not need a network of accomplices. He could act alone. The concept of a lone attacker created a difficult problem for investigators because there might be no group conversations to monitor, no organization to infiltrate, and no obvious warning from others. The search therefore depended heavily on evidence connected to the individual. What materials had been obtained? Where had preparation taken place? Who had access to the knowledge and resources needed to create multiple devices? As investigators examined these questions, they began to understand that the attacks required a level of preparation that could not have happened entirely by accident. The devices had been assembled before they appeared in public spaces. The locations had been chosen. The timing of the attacks showed planning. Behind the public chaos was a private process. Somewhere, someone had been making decisions. The investigation also relied on information gathered after the third bombing. As with many criminal cases, the final incident created additional evidence that helped connect the separate events. Each scene contributed information, but together they formed a much clearer picture. The attacks were not isolated. They were a single campaign. And the campaign had a signature. A repeated method. A repeated target selection pattern. A repeated ideological message. The pressure on investigators increased as they moved closer to identifying the offender. For the families of victims, the investigation represented more than a search for answers. It represented the possibility that someone would be held responsible. For survivors, it represented the hope that the person who had caused so much harm could be stopped from hurting anyone else. Justice begins with accountability. But accountability requires identification. The person responsible had to be found. As police continued their work, attention began turning toward individuals whose behavior and beliefs matched the evidence. Investigators examined possible connections to extremist groups and reviewed information about people who had previously expressed violent or hateful views. Among those names was David Copeland. At the time, he was 22 years old. He was not a nationally known extremist figure. He was not the leader of an organization. He was an individual whose actions had remained hidden until the consequences forced them into public view. The investigation would soon focus on him more closely. Evidence gathered during searches and inquiries would begin connecting him to the attacks. Materials associated with bomb-making, extremist beliefs, and the preparation of the devices would become central to the case. The anonymous figure behind the bombings was beginning to take shape. The question that had haunted London for nearly 2 weeks was finally approaching an answer. Who had carried out the attacks? The evidence was leading investigators toward one person. But identifying a suspect was only the beginning. The next challenge would be proving what had happened, understanding why it happened, and ensuring that the person responsible faced the consequences of his actions. The investigation was moving toward its decisive moment. The search through fragments was becoming a complete picture. And soon, the name David Copeland would become permanently linked with one of the most serious acts of extremist violence in modern British history.